The wind in the high Montana peaks didn't just blow, it hunted. It was a voracious, invisible predator that shrieked through the canyons and clawed at the sod roof of the cabin with fingers of ice. Elara Vance fought it, just as she had fought every single day since her husband, Jebediah, had been put in the frozen ground, her hands wrapped in rags and raw from the cold, strained against the gray splintered wood of the fence line. She tried to hold the rail in place, her breath coming in short, smokeless bursts that the wind stole instantly, but the gale tore the wood from her grip and hurled it into the deep snowdrift. Elara cursed, the sound swallowed by the storm. She was only 32, but the brutal winter and the heavy cloak of grief had carved her face into something much older, something harder. She felt brittle, like the last dead leaf clinging desperately to a black branch in a gale. Suddenly, a panicked, frantic squawking erupted from the lean-to coop. It wasn't the usual fuss of chickens. It was the sound of terror. Elara's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing against the stinging ice. She dropped the hammer and ran, her heavy boots sinking past her knees in the fresh powder. "No," she breathed, the word dissolving into the whiteout. "No, you don't take this too." She had 3 cows frozen solid in the north pasture, like macabre statues since November. She had half a sack of weevil-ridden flour, and she had 2 chickens. They were her last living, breathing claim to this God-forsaken patch of earth. A gray shadow, swift and silent, bolted from behind the coop, a splash of white feathers dangling from its jaws. A coyote. It was gaunt, its ribs showing through its mangy fur, as desperate and starved as she was. It saw her and scrambled to clear the drift, but its paws sank in the soft snow. Elara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy greener shotgun leaning against the cabin wall, the metal so cold it burned her fingers through her worn gloves. She didn't aim. She pointed. The blast was deafening, a cannon shot shattering the frozen silence. The coyote folded mid-leap, becoming a ragged heap of fur and blood against the pristine white. The second chicken, the survivor, flapped hysterically by the woodpile. Elara walked over to the dead predator. She nudged it with her boot. It was just bones and desperation, exactly like everything else in this territory. She retrieved the dead hen, its body still warm, and carried it back inside, leaving the coyote for the buzzards, if any were foolish enough to fly in this hell. She plucked the bird with mechanical efficiency, her stomach tight with a cold, hard anger. This land took. It took Jebediah. It took the herd, and it tried to take her food. She would not let it take her. She was stoking the fire, the smell of singed pin feathers filling the small, dark cabin, when the sound came. It wasn't a knock. It was a heavy, dull pounding, like a dead weight hitting the timber. Elara froze. No one came here. The nearest neighbor, Old Man Calloway, was 12 miles east and smart enough to stay indoors. Traders avoided this pass after the first snow. The only person who ever came uninvited had been Jebediah, stumbling home drunk and mean. The shotgun was on the table, reloaded. She picked it up, its weight familiar and comforting. "Who's there?" Her voice was rough from disuse, sounding foreign to her own ears. A pause, then a sound like gravel rolling downhill. "Shelter?" Just the one word. It was enough to make the hair on her arms stand up. She moved to the single small window, wiping the frost from the glass with her sleeve. He was huge, a mountain of a man, draped in furs so caked with ice, he looked more beast than human. He leaned heavily on the doorframe, and even in the dying gray light, she could see the dark, frozen stain that covered his left shoulder and side. He looked up, and she saw his face beneath a matted tangle of dark hair and beard. He looked like he had been chewed up and spat out by the mountains themselves. "Go away," she said, her voice flat. "I've got nothing for you." "Don't need nothing," the man rasped, his breath pluming in the cold air. "I'll trade." "I'm not interested." He staggered, catching himself on the rough logs. He looked past her, his gaze fixed on the wisp of smoke rising from her chimney with a hunger that terrified her. "One night," he said, his voice straining. "Just the floor, till the storm breaks." I said no. She raised the shotgun where he could see the twin barrels through the glass. The man grunted. He reached with his good arm and unslung a heavy pack from his back. It fell to the snow with a muffled thud. He fumbled with the straps, his movements stiff and pained, and pulled out a bundle of skins. 10, he said. He threw them at the door. Prime beaver, tanned, 10 pelts for the floor for one night. Elara stared at the pelts. They were dark, thick, perfect. 10. Enough to buy flour and feed and powder for a year. Enough to pay the land tax Jebediah had left her with. It was an absurd, desperate offer. A man would have to be dying to offer that much for a few hours by a fire. She looked back at him. He was dying. She hated this. She hated the fear coiling in her belly. Jebediah had taught her what a man's presence meant. It meant noise. It meant pain. It meant taking. The silence she had earned since his death was the only luxury she owned. But the man was swaying. He wasn't a threat. He was a corpse waiting to happen. And those pelts. "Just the floor," she said, her voice sharp. "You try anything, I'll shoot you where you stand." "Just the floor," he agreed. She unbarred the door. The wind shoved it open, blasting the cabin with ice and snow. He stumbled in, bringing the smell of pine, old blood, and the frozen wilderness with him. He was even bigger inside, his head nearly brushing the roof beams. He collapsed onto the dirt floor near the hearth, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He didn't even look at her. He just curled toward the meager heat, his bad shoulder drawn up protectively. Elara barred the door behind him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cabin, her tiny sanctuary, felt suddenly small, crowded, and dangerous. He seemed to fall asleep instantly, or perhaps unconsciousness had just claimed him. Elara cooked her chicken, the rich smell of broth filling the room. She ate standing up, the shotgun never leaving her sight. The man did not move. She debated. She could take the pelts and drag him out, let the cold finish him. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. He was a man, and men were trouble, but she had seen enough death. When it was time to sleep, she laid her thinnest quilt on the floor, a good 6 feet from where he lay. "That's yours," she said. He stirred, his eyes opening. They were pale, a startling icy blue, and clouded with fever. He looked at the blanket, then at her. He nodded, crawling onto it with a deep groan of pain. Elara retreated to her own narrow cot, taking the shotgun with her. She lay it beside her, her hand resting on the cold stock. She did not undress. She lay there listening to the two sounds that filled the night, the endless shriek of the wind outside and the harsh, wet breathing of the stranger beside her fire. Sleep wouldn't come. She watched him. The firelight cast deep, dancing shadows across his face. He was younger than she had first thought, under the grime and beard. But it was a hard face, marked by more than just the elements. Sometime after midnight, the nightmares started. "He didn't shoot," he whimpered, a low, choked sound, his good hand clenched and unclenched. "No, not again. Let him go. Let him—" He thrashed, a violent jerk that sent a spasm of agony through his wounded shoulder. He cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and then went rigid. Elara sat up, the shotgun in her lap, the hammers pulled back. Jebediah had been a loud, angry drunk. He yelled in his sleep, cursed at men in his dreams. His violence was simple, blunt like a mule's kick. This was different. The stranger's brokenness felt familiar. It wasn't the sound of a bully. It was the sound of a man being hunted, a sound of profound, bottomless guilt. It was a pain she recognized, not from her husband, but from the mirror. She sat there watching him until the first gray light of dawn touched the window. She did not lower the gun, but she did not move toward him either. When she finally rose, the cabin was bitter cold. The fire was down to pale embers. The stranger hadn't moved. He was too still. Elara walked over to him, nudging his boot with her foot. "Get up. Morning?" He didn't respond. She knelt, her movements weary. She put her hand on his forehead. He was burning, a dry, searing heat that spoke of deep infection. His breathing was shallow. She had a choice. She could drag him out, take the pelts, and let the winter have him. But he had. Traded his survival for one night. He had kept his word. She sighed, a long, weary sound. "Damn you," she whispered. She went to the door and gathered a bucket of clean snow. Setting it on the hearth to melt, she got her sewing box, the one with heavy sailcloth needles, her skinning knife, and from the small chest under her cot, she pulled out the last of Jebediah's whiskey. She pulled back the filthy, frozen furs from his shoulder. The smell hit her instantly, sour, metallic, and rank. The wound was a mess. It was puckered, swollen, and an angry blackish purple. The shirt beneath was glued to it with dried blood and pus. "This is going to hurt," she told the unconscious man. She soaked a rag in the hot water and whiskey and pressed it to the wound. He screamed, a raw, terrifying sound, and his eyes flew open. He stared at her, not with recognition, but with pure animal panic. His good hand shot out and clamped around her wrist like a bear trap. Elara didn't flinch. She didn't fight. She just met his gaze. His blue eyes were wild, dilated with fever and pain. "You're infected," she said, her voice calm and low. "You hold still, or you'll lose the arm. You hold still, and I'll clean it." He stared at her, his chest heaving. He was trying to focus, trying to understand where he was. He saw the cabin, the fire, the woman. He saw the knife in her other hand. He saw the bloody rag. Slowly, agonizingly, his grip on her wrist loosened. He fell back, his teeth gritted. "Do it." "I'm Elara," she said. "Now lie still." She worked quickly, her hands sure. She had stitched up cows and horses. A man wasn't so different. She cut the shirt away, her stomach rolling at the stench. The bullet was still in there, lodged against the bone. "This part's bad," she warned. She didn't wait for a reply. She poured the rest of the whiskey straight into the wound. He roared, a sound that shook the cabin and arched his back off the floor. But he didn't grab her. He just gripped the quilt in his fist, his knuckles white. Elara took the knife, sterilized in the flame, and she cut. He passed out before she fished the flattened piece of lead out. She cleaned the hole, packed it with the last of her yellow salve, and stitched it closed with fishing line. Her hands were steady until she finished. Then she sat back on her heels, covered in his sweat and blood, and shook. She spent the rest of the day forcing broth and willow bark tea between his lips. He drifted in and out of consciousness. The fever raged, then broke, then raged again. He woke for real 2 days later. The storm was still blowing, but weaker. Elara was sitting at the table, cleaning the shotgun. She heard him stir and looked over. His eyes were clear. The fever was down. He looked at the new clean bandage on his shoulder. He looked at the empty bowl by his side. He looked at her. "You dug it out," he rasped. It was festering. He tried to sit up, and this time he managed it, bracing himself with his good arm. He was weak, but the raw strength was still there. "Why?" "You paid for one night," Elara said, turning back to her gun. "The rest is interest. You'll live." He watched her for a long time. He took in the sparse cabin, the worn-out furniture, the way she handled the weapon with easy familiarity. He looked at the door where the wind was still finding cracks to whistle through. "Your fence is still down," he said. "I know, and the roof on that south corner is about to give." "It'll hold," Elara said, stopping her cleaning to look at him. "No, it won't," he said. "Not through another storm." He shifted, testing his arm. "I'll fix them." She raised an eyebrow. "You can barely sit." "I'll be standing tomorrow," he said. It wasn't a boast, it was a statement of fact. "I'll fix the fence and the roof in exchange for more shelter, for my keep." He was offering a trade, not asking for charity. He was a proud man, even broken. She understood that. "The work is hard," she said. "I'm strong," he replied. "Fine," Elara said. "You fix the fence. You can stay till you're healed. Then you go." Done. A new silence settled between them. It was different from the first night. It wasn't just fear and suspicion. It was an acknowledgement, a truce. Over the next few days, he proved true to his word. His name, he said, was Thorn. He spoke little else. He spent the daylight hours outside, his bad arm tucked into his coat, hammering and sawing with his good one. The sound of his work became the new rhythm of the homestead. Thud, thud, thud. Elara watched him from the window. He worked until he was gray with exhaustion, then came inside, ate whatever she put in front of him, and fell asleep by the fire. He never complained. He never spoke of his wound, though she knew it must be agonizing. They rarely spoke. Past the salt, or storms turning, was the extent of it. But the glances held weight. She found herself looking at his hands. They were huge, scarred, and calloused, but they were gentle with the tools, precise. He was mending her world, piece by piece. He was doing the work Jebediah had always promised to do, and never had. A heavy loneliness, one she had mistaken for peace, began to ache in her chest. It was a mutual quiet. He was as walled in as she was. She would catch him watching her as she kneaded bread, his blue eyes unreadable, and she would feel a strange flush of heat. The snow finally stopped, but the cold locked them in. One night, the cabin was thick with the smell of pine smoke and the stew she'd made from the second chicken. The air was close. She felt grimy, layered in sweat and wool and the tension of his presence. She needed to wash. She heated the water, her back to him. She hung the old quilt, the one he had slept on before she cleaned his wound, from a rope strung across the corner. It created a flimsy, pitiful screen. She stepped behind it, her heart thumping. This was foolish. He was right there, but she had to feel clean. She stripped off her layers, her skin rising in goose flesh. She stepped into the small metal tub, the hot water stinging. She sunk down, letting the heat soak into her bones. She scrubbed her arms, her neck, the grime of the last week. It was too quiet. The only sound was the drip of water and the crackle of the fire. She looked at the quilt in the flickering light. She could see his shadow. He was on his cot. He was sitting up. He was watching her shadow on the cloth. Elara froze, her breath catching. This was the moment Jebediah would have laughed, would have torn the barrier down and taken what he wanted. She waited, her body rigid for the sound of boots. Nothing. He just sat. He just watched. A strange, defiant heat bloomed in her belly. It was not fear. It was something else, something sharp and alive. She was being seen, not grabbed, not hurt, just seen. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her arms. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall. She began to wash it, her shadow moving, stretching, her arms rising and falling, her neck exposed. She was testing him. She was testing herself. He did not move. She finished. Her skin flushed red from the heat and the scrubbing. She stepped out, dried herself quickly, and pulled on her long flannel nightgown. Her hands were shaking. She took a deep breath. She pulled the quilt down from the rope. Thorn was sitting exactly as his shadow had shown, but he wasn't looking at her. He was staring deep into the fire, his expression tight, his hands fisted on his knees. The air between them was so thick she could barely breathe it. She said nothing. She went to her cot, slipped under the blankets, and turned her back to him, the shotgun still within reach. But she knew, as she lay there staring at the rough cabin wall, that she would not be using it tonight. The days that followed settled into a quiet, heavy rhythm. Thorn was a man who did not waste motion. His first task was the fence line. Elara watched from the window as he worked, his wounded shoulder held stiff, his good arm doing the work of two. He didn't just hammer the old planks back on. He dug new post holes, wading through thigh-deep snow to find solid ground, setting the posts with a grim, steady determination. He was strong, yes, but it was his patience that held her. Jebediah would have cursed, thrown the hammer, and given up, blaming the frozen ground or the bad wood. Thorn just worked. He met the land's resistance with his own silent, unyielding will. One evening, the wind was low. A rare stillness had fallen over the territory. She was mending one of her wool stockings, the needle pushing through the thick yarn. He was oiling his rifle, the metal parts laid out on a piece of hide on the table. The cabin was warm, smelling of wood smoke and coffee. "This place was supposed to be a new start," she said, her voice sounding strange and loud in the quiet. Thorn did not look up, but his hands stilled. She took it as encouragement. "Jebediah, my husband. He heard there was gold in Alder Gulch. He heard a man could make a fortune. He bought this claim with the last of my father's money, said we'd be rich in a year, said we'd have a big house, cattle." She jabbed the needle through the wool. "He never even bought the cattle." She waited. Thorn carefully wiped the breech block, his scarred hands surprisingly precise. "He liked the town more than the homestead," she continued, the words coming easier now, like a stream thawing. "He liked the saloon, the cards. He was not a lucky man, but he was a hopeful one, always sure the next hand would be the one." "Hope is a costly thing," Thorn said, his voice a low rumble. "It cost me everything," she whispered. "He left debts. He owed money to the bank, and he owed money to Sterling Pike." She spat the name like it was poison. "Pike runs the land office, but he runs the saloon too. He owns most of the men in town, one way or another. She looked at her hands, at the needle. Jebediah came home one night, drunk, worse than usual. He said Pike had offered him a deal, said he would forgive the debt, all of it. Elara's hands were shaking. Pike wanted the land, and he said he wanted me too. For the winter, said he'd take the deed out in trade if Jebediah couldn't pay. The cabin was dead silent. The only sound was the faint pop of an ember in the hearth. Thorne slowly, deliberately began to reassemble the rifle. Click, snap, the sound of metal meeting metal. Jebediah told me he was thinking on it, thinking on selling me for a few months to settle a card debt. Her voice broke, thick with a shame so old it felt like part of her bones. He died 2 days later. His horse threw him, and he broke his neck. And I was glad. God forgive me. I was so glad he was dead. She had never said those words aloud. She looked at Thorne, expecting disgust, judgment, anything. He met her gaze. His eyes were not cold, but they were not soft. They were hard, like forged steel. Has Pike been back? No, not since the funeral. He sent a man to offer condolences. I told him to get off my land. He'll be back, Thorne said. It was not a guess. It was a fact. When the thaw comes, he'll be back. He stood, his full height seeming to shrink the cabin. He checked the action on the rifle, then set it against the wall. He looked at her, his face shadowed. He won't find you alone. Elara stared at him, her heart doing a slow, painful turn in her chest. It was the first time in her life a man had offered her protection without asking for a price. The next day the wind returned, hitting the cabin like a train, a solid wall of shrieking ice. For 2 days, they were trapped. The tiny space became a pressure cooker. They moved around each other in a careful, awkward dance. When she cooked, he sat on his pallet, sharpening his skinning knife until the edge gleamed. When he needed to get to the wood, she had to press herself against the wall to let him pass. His arm would brush her side, a touch of wool and solid muscle, and she would flinch, her skin prickling. The tension was a third person in the room. The first night of the storm, the cabin grew deadly cold. Elara lay on her cot, buried under every blanket she owned, and still she shivered. From the floor she heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic clicking. She sat up in the dim light. Thorne was on his pallet, curled on his side. He was shaking, his teeth were chattering, a desperate rhythm he was trying to suppress. He had given her the better spot closer to the hearth. He had taken the drafty floor, and the cold was sinking into his bones, into his half-healed wound. She threw back her blankets. The air was so cold it stung her lungs. He heard the movement, his eyes snapping open, instantly wary. "What is it?" "You're freezing," she whispered. "I'm fine." "You're a bad liar." She grabbed the thickest quilt from her cot and walked to him. She spread it over him, tucking it around his shoulders. He was still shaking. She hesitated. This was not enough. She grabbed her other blanket. She did not go back to her bed. She laid the second blanket on the floor next to his pallet, not touching, but close. She lay down, her back to him, and pulled the edge of his new heavy quilt over herself. They were 2 separate people on 2 separate beds, sharing a small ocean of warmth. She did not sleep, but after a long time, she heard the chattering stop. She heard his breathing deepen. The storm broke on the 3rd morning. The world outside was a pristine, glittering white. That evening, they sat by the fire, exhausted from digging out. Thorne reached out, his big scarred hand moving slowly. A long strand of her hair had fallen forward. He hooked it with his forefinger, his touch impossibly light, and tucked it behind her ear. His rough fingers grazed the skin of her neck. It wasn't a grab. It was gentle. A jolt went through Elara, so powerful it stole her breath. She leaned into his hand, a pure animal instinct. Then panic struck. The ghost of Jebediah was in the room. "Easy, aren't you?" She jerked back as if burned. "Don't," she whispered, her voice tight. She scrambled to her feet and fled to her cot, turning her back to him. She heard him let out a long, slow breath. He did not speak. She was up before dawn, furious at herself, furious at him. She went outside and attacked the woodpile with the heavy splitting maul. She swung with frantic energy, trying to destroy the feeling in her chest. the loneliness, the shame, the desire. Elara, his voice came from the door. She ignored him, raising the maul again. "Leave me be," she snarled. "You'll hurt yourself." He was there, standing over her. He took the maul from her hands. His strength was effortless. He didn't raise his voice. He just took it, and she broke. She collapsed against the woodpile, sobbing dry, gasping sounds. "I can't," she choked out. "I can't do this anymore. I'm so alone. Every day it's so cold, and I'm ashamed." Ashamed of what? Of wanting, of feeling. I'm tired of being afraid of a kind touch. I'm tired of being so hungry. I'm just this animal, like that coyote. "You're not an animal, Elara," he said, his voice rough. "You're a survivor. There's no shame in that." He offered her his hand. She took it. He pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. That night, the truth lay bare. He knelt in front of her by the fire and took her hands. Elara, just her name. She trembled. "I'm afraid." "I know," he said. "Me too." He kissed her. It wasn't the bruising, selfish kiss of her husband. It was a question. It was uncertain, hesitant, tasting of salt and wood smoke. She answered by placing her hand on his rough cheek. He pulled back, searching her eyes. "Are you sure?" "I'm not," she whispered, "and I don't care." He carried her to the cot. It was a thaw, a slow, aching melting of two people frozen for a long time. When he finally moved over her, it was an emotional release so total it left them both shaking. For the first time since Jebediah died, Elara slept in the arms of another, feeling safe. She woke in the dark to find him sitting by the hearth, staring into the dying fire. "You're not sleeping," she said. "I shouldn't have stayed," he said, his voice flat. "I shouldn't have touched you. I bring trouble. Why? Because you're a man? Because I'm me. I used to hunt men for money, a bounty hunter, a man-catcher." He confessed then, the words spilling out like poison. He told her about a warrant from Wyoming, a sheriff named Degan. He told her about a boy named Jamie he had tracked and killed for $60, only to find out the boy was innocent, a witness to Degan's crimes. He told her he had gone back, confronted Degan, and shot 2 deputies to escape. "Degan wants me dead so I can't talk. Every bounty hunter from here to the border is looking for me. That bullet was from one of them." He looked at her. "I've marked you, Elara. When they find me, they'll see you as my accomplice." Elara didn't flinch. She stood, went to a loose floorboard, and pulled out a leather ledger. "You think you've marked me? Look." She showed him Jebediah's debts. The final entry. "Winter tenancy of Elara. Agreed. Settled Tuesday." "He was going to sell me like a cow," she said. "We all have ghosts, Thorn. Yours carry guns. Mine carried a wedding ring. I'm not afraid of your ghosts." 2 weeks later, the battle arrived. A knock, a letter from the land office. Sterling Pike was calling in the debt. Notice of abandonment. She had 30 days to pay $40 or lose the land. "He's stealing it," Thorn said. "We fight it." "Fight Pike? He is the law here." "Then I'll go," Thorn growled. "I'll delay him." "You can't. You're wanted." "I have the pelts. I have $10. I'll bribe the clerk." He left the next morning. The ride to town was agonizing. He walked into the land office, dropped the pelts and gold on the counter, and told the clerk to file a correction. But as the clerk reached for the bribe, the door opened. A man with a heavy gray mustache and cold eyes stood there, Sheriff Degan. "File it!" Thorn roared, shoving the bribe at the clerk. He spun and ran. "Stop!" Degan shouted. Gunshots cracked. Thorn vaulted onto his mule and bolted, escaping by inches. He had bought Elara time, but he had led the devil to her door. Back at the cabin, 2 of Pike's henchmen, Grix and another thug, arrived. They pushed into the cabin, sneering at Elara. "Pike wants an inspection," Grix said, reaching for her hair. He said to be thorough. Elara moved faster than thought. She jammed the greener shotgun into Grix's stomach, then angled it down and pulled the trigger. The floor exploded. Splinters and shot tore into Grix's leg. He screamed. "The next one goes in your belly," Elara snarled. "Tell Pike I'm occupying my land." They fled. Hours later, Thorn burst in, breathless. "Degan is here. He's with Pike. They're coming." "Let them," Elara whispered, pulling him close. "We'll be ready." They waited through the night. At dawn, the wolves arrived. 10 men, led by Degan and Pike, surrounded the cabin. "Come out!" Degan shouted. "We burn it down in 10 seconds." "Go to the root cellar," Thorn ordered. "No," Elara said, grabbing the shotgun. "This is my house." A shot rang out from Pike's men, shattering the window. The siege began. Bullets tore through the wood. Thorn took a hit to the thigh, collapsing in a pool of blood. "I'm hit! It's the artery!" Elara saw the end coming. She saw the shed full of hay and oil. "Cover me!" she yelled. She sprinted into the gunfire. Bullets zipped past her ears. She reached the shed, doused it in oil, and threw a match. It erupted, sending a wall of thick black smoke rolling over the attackers. Blinded, the men panicked. Thorn, dragging himself to the window, saw Grix emerging from the smoke. He fired. Grix fell. But Thorn was fading. He slumped against the wall. Elara crawled back inside. "Thorn, wake up!" He was cold. Outside, footsteps crunched. It was over. She threw herself over his body. Then, thunder. Not the sky, but hooves. Old Man Calloway and 6 armed ranch hands rode out of the trees, rifles leveled. "That's far enough, Pike!" Calloway roared. "This is a lynching party, and it ends now!" Degan tried to raise his gun, but a ranch hand shot him in the arm. Defeated and outgunned, Pike and Degan fled. Thorn was barely alive. Calloway helped Elara stitch him up. She held him through the night, whispering promises of a future she wasn't sure they had. He survived. Months passed. They rebuilt. The cabin was strong again. Then came the trial. Calloway had contacted the territorial marshal. The clerk from the land office testified against Pike. Then Thorn walked in. He confessed everything. His past, the murder of the boy, under orders, the corruption. He damned himself to save the territory. Pike and Degan were sentenced to hang. But Thorn was still a wanted man. The marshal gave him 24 hours to run before the Wyoming warrant was enforced. He met Elara at the edge of town. "I bring trouble," he said, preparing to leave. "You brought me life," she cried, kissing him fiercely. "You come back. I don't care how. You come back." He rode south and didn't look back. Elara worked. She sold the pelts, bought stock, and turned the homestead into a fortress. She waited. Summer came and went. Then a letter. "I am here, they are not." I think of the hearth. Spring returned. Elara was in the barn loft when a shadow fell across the door. A man stood there, clean-shaven, thinner, but with the same storm-gray eyes. "My name," he said hesitantly, "is Matthew. The marshal took care of it. Thorn is dead. I heard a widow lived here. Wondered if the bed was still warm." Elara scrambled down the ladder. She slapped his chest, a sharp sound of relief and anger, then pulled him into a kiss that tasted of homecoming. "You're late," she whispered. They climbed to the loft, bathed in golden light. They were alive. They were whole. He held her, a solid, warm promise. "One night for 10 furs, huh?" he whispered. "I gave you far more," she smiled, "and I'll keep giving it as long as you stay." He tightened his grip. He was staying. Did Elara and Matthew's journey capture your heart? If you want more stories of rugged survival and undying love, smash that like button and don't forget to subscribe to Dust and Legends. Leave a comment below. What would you have traded for shelter in a blizzard?